In the world of politics and power, true leadership is rare, but occasionally a single act of compassion reveals the heart behind the title. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader from Burkina Faso, whose unexpected gesture on the streets of Paris would come to symbolize a new vision for African leadership. What happened that rainy evening in the City of Light wasn't planned for the cameras. It wasn't orchestrated for political gain. It was simply a moment of humanity that would echo across continents. This is the story of why Captain Ibrahim Traoré gave up his presidential suite to a homeless woman in Paris, and what it tells us about the future of leadership in Africa. November in Paris. The City of Lights draped in autumn colors. A high-level African delegation had arrived for a summit between European and African nations. Among them was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who had risen to prominence in Burkina Faso. For Ibrahim, this wasn't just another diplomatic mission. It was an opportunity to advocate for a new relationship between Africa and the West, one based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Mr. President, we've prepared our finest presidential suite for your stay. It offers the best view of the Seine and the Eiffel Tower. Thank you for your hospitality. The accommodations are necessary, but I appreciate the gesture. Those who knew Ibrahim weren't surprised by his humility. Despite his position, he had maintained the simple lifestyle of his military background, often refusing the lavish trappings that came with political power. The European delegation is pushing for continued preferential access to our mineral resources. They're framing it as development assistance. We aren't here to continue patterns of extraction. Africa's resources must benefit African people first. This isn't about one country's interests, it's about the dignity of an entire continent. This was the Ibrahim approach, direct, principled and uncompromising when it came to Africa's interests. But the true measure of his character would reveal itself away from the negotiating table. The first day of negotiations had been tense. As evening fell, Ibrahim decided to take a walk to clear his mind, dismissing his security detail with instructions to follow at a distance. Paris in November can be unforgiving. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, turning the romantic city into a harsher landscape for those without shelter. It was near the Pont Neuf that Ibrahim noticed her, an elderly woman, perhaps in her 70s, clutching her few possessions in a plastic bag, seeking refuge from the downpour. "Spare change for some food, monsieur." Her name was Marie. For 3 years, she had lived on the streets of Paris after losing her apartment following her husband's death, and a series of financial hardships. "How long have you been out in this weather, madame?" "The rain?" "The few hours." "The street?" "Much longer." What was meant to be a brief encounter extended into a conversation. Marie spoke of her life before homelessness, her work as a teacher, her children who had moved abroad, the series of misfortunes that had left her with nothing. In my country we have a saying, "The measure of a society is found in how it treats its most vulnerable members." Then perhaps all our societies have room to improve, monsieur. "Madame, would you do me the honor of accepting my hospitality tonight? No one should sleep in such weather." What happened next would become the story that traveled across continents. "Mr. President, is everything all right?" "Everything is fine. This is Madame Marie. She will be staying in my suite tonight." "Sir, perhaps we could arrange different accommodations for the lady." The presidential suite has a bedroom I won't use, a sitting room I won't sit in, and luxury that will be wasted on me while someone sleeps on wet concrete. My decision is made." When pressed later about where he would stay, Ibrahim simply shrugged and mentioned that the small office adjoining the delegation's meeting room had a comfortable couch. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me, because dignity isn't something that should be earned, madame. It is the birthright of every human being. Rest well. Tomorrow, if you're willing, I'd like to hear more of your story. Perhaps together we can find a more permanent solution than one night's shelter. What Ibrahim didn't know was that a member of his delegation had recorded the exchange in the lobby. By morning, the video had spread across social media. The story exploded overnight. African leader gives presidential suite to homeless woman, read headlines across the globe. But what started as a human interest story quickly evolved into something more profound. Your gesture last night has touched many people, Mr. President. It wasn't meant to be public, and it was only a room, perhaps. But symbols matter in diplomacy, as I think you know very well. By midday, what had happened became clear. Marie's story had put a human face on the growing homelessness crisis in European capitals. Meanwhile, the contrast between Ibrahim's simplicity and the opulence prepared for visiting dignitaries highlighted questions about resource allocation in international relations. Was your action meant as a critique of European policies on homelessness? It was meant as a human response to another human in need. But if we're discussing policies, then yes, I believe any nation wealthy enough to host international summits in luxury hotels is wealthy enough to ensure no one sleeps on its streets. Some are calling this a publicity stunt. Those who think helping one person is an effective publicity stunt understand neither publicity nor helping. Marie is one woman among thousands in similar circumstances. The true measure of our summit's success will be whether those thousands find dignity, not whether I receive praise for one night's gesture. But the story had taken on a life of its own. Across Africa, Ibrahim's action had resonated deeply, particularly with younger generations tired of leadership distant from ordinary people's struggles. This is what Pan-African leadership looks like, caring about human dignity everywhere, not just within your borders. Ibrahim showed that African leaders can set moral examples on the world stage instead of just seeking aid or investment. What many found most powerful was that Ibrahim had never intended the gesture to be public. There was no camera crew, no press release. It was simply consistent with his character. He asked me about my life, my struggles. He listened, really listened. When was the last time anyone in power truly listened to someone like me? Marie's story itself became a catalyst. Her history as an educator who had fallen through France's social safety net after a series of personal tragedies highlighted systemic issues in how societies protect their vulnerable members. Madame Marie, these professionals believe they can help with your situation. With your permission, I've established a small fund to assist with immediate housing and whatever support you need to regain stability. Why would you do all this? Because we cannot speak of international cooperation while ignoring individual suffering. What use is diplomacy if not to improve lives? But Ibrahim went further. He invited Marie to address a side session of the summit, giving voice to those normally excluded from such high-level discussions. I was invisible until yesterday. How many others remain invisible to you? How many voices do you not hear when making decisions that affect their lives? Her testimony was brief but powerful, and it marked the beginning of a shift in how the summit proceeded. Something had changed in the diplomatic atmosphere. Ibrahim's gesture and Marie's testimony had created an uncomfortable but necessary disruption in the normal patterns of international dialogue. We come to these summits and speak of billions in aid, investment and trade. We debate abstract policies in rooms far removed from their consequences. But true partnership, whether between nations or individuals, begins with seeing each other's humanity. Africa doesn't seek charity. We seek justice, fair terms for our resources, respect for our sovereignty. recognition of our right to chart our own path toward development. The message wasn't new, but the context had transformed how it was received. Ibrahim had demonstrated through action, not just words, what he meant by dignity and respect. "You've created quite a stir, my young friend. It wasn't my intention, but perhaps it's useful to remind everyone why we are here. Not for diplomatic games, but for real human impact. Your generation speaks differently than mine, but I cannot deny the effectiveness of your approach. This isn't about generational approaches. It's about remembering that leadership is service, not privilege. That's a principle as old as our cultures." By the summit's conclusion, several concrete changes had emerged. The final communiqué included stronger language on equitable resource contracts, increased emphasis on direct benefits to local communities, and new commitments to social protection on both continents. Small steps, perhaps, but meaningful ones. And they had been catalyzed by a single act of compassion that reminded everyone involved of the human dimension behind policy discussions. When Ibrahim returned home, he found something unexpected. The story had transformed how many across Africa viewed both him and the potential for African leadership on the world stage. For a new generation of Africans, Ibrahim's action embodied their aspirations for leadership, principled, compassionate, and unafraid to demonstrate African values in international contexts. The attention given to one small act of humanity shows how hungry we all are for leadership that embodies our deepest values. But real change isn't made through symbolic gestures. It's built through consistent action. Day after day, Ibrahim used the platform he'd gained to amplify his vision for an Africa that solves its own problems, cares for its own people, and engages with the world from a position of moral authority, not weakness. So you brought honor to us in Paris. The honor belongs to our traditions that teach us to see the humanity in everyone. I simply remembered the lessons my grandparents taught me. This was Ibrahim's gift, connecting ancient African values to contemporary leadership challenges. In his view, Africa's renaissance would come not from imitating other models, but from reclaiming its own ethical traditions. In Paris, Marie's life had transformed. Through the attention her story received, she was reconnected with her estranged daughter. The fund Ibrahim established helped her secure permanent housing, and she began volunteering with organizations, helping others experiencing homelessness. One act of dignity restored not just my shelter, but my voice. This is what I try to give others now, not just assistance, but recognition of their full humanity. Across Africa, Ibrahim's approach sparked conversations about what authentic African leadership might look like in the 21st century. Ibrahim showed that power exercised with compassion isn't weakness, it's strength. That's the leadership Africa needs. What's significant is that he acted from cultural values, not political calculation. That authenticity resonates across borders. 6 months after the Paris summit, several concrete developments could be traced to what some now called the Ibrahim effect. A coalition of younger African leaders had formed, committed to bringing moral clarity and direct human engagement to international relations. Their approach emphasized consistency between values and actions. Across the continent, interest in community-centered leadership programs surged. Young people increasingly spoke about public service as a calling rather than a career path. What? Is it true you gave up your luxury hotel room to help someone? What matters isn't what I did once in Paris, but what each of you does every day in your communities. Leadership isn't a title, it's how you treat people when no one is watching. Those seeking to understand Ibrahim's philosophy often pointed to his background. Raised in a village where community survival depended on mutual support, he had never separated personal ethics from public responsibility. Many leaders speak of helping the vulnerable, Few act on it personally. What makes you different? Perhaps I don't see the separation others do between personal and political ethics. If I walk past suffering I can address, what credibility do I have to speak about national or international justice? Our resources must serve our people first. This isn't just economic policy, it's basic moral logic. A parent feeds their children before selling food to neighbors. This clarity of purpose defined Ibrahim's approach. For him, leadership wasn't complex. It was about applying simple ethical principles consistently, whether in village disputes or international summits. Africa doesn't need saviors or strongmen. It needs servants, leaders who understand their power comes from the people and must be used for the people. When I'm asked about my vision for African leadership, it's simple. Leaders who sleep well when their people sleep well, who eat well when their people eat well, who know peace when their people know peace. This wasn't revolutionary rhetoric. It was an invocation of traditional African concepts of leadership, where a chief's authority was inseparable from their responsibility to community welfare. 2 years after the Paris incident, Ibrahim's approach had become a case study in authentic leadership. What had begun as a human interest story had evolved into a reference point in discussions about ethics in governance. What the Ibrahim approach demonstrates is that moral leadership isn't a luxury, it's a practical necessity for building public trust. Perhaps most significantly, Ibrahim's example had challenged other leaders to demonstrate their values through action, not just rhetoric. You changed my life, but I've learned you've changed many others too. We changed each other's paths, madame. You reminded me why public service matters, not for power, but for the difference we can make in individual lives. This was perhaps Ibrahim's most important legacy, reminding a cynical world that politics could still be about human connection, that international relations could be informed by personal ethics, and that leadership is measured not by power acquired, but by lives improved. But the story of why Ibrahim Traoré gave his presidential suite to a homeless woman in Paris reveals something essential about leadership that transcends borders and politics. In a world of complex geopolitical challenges, his approach reminds us that the foundation of any meaningful progress remains simple, seeing the humanity in others and acting accordingly. Our ancestors knew that true authority comes not from force but from moral example. Africa's future will be secured not when we have the strongest armies or economies, but when we demonstrate the strongest commitment to human dignity, starting with how we treat each person we encounter. In giving up a presidential suite, Ibrahim Traoré gained something more valuable, a platform from which to advocate for a vision of leadership rooted in Africa's deepest values. And in doing so, he reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful political statements aren't made in speeches or treaties, but in simple acts of human compassion.